everyone. Good morning, and welcome to the 68th Conference on World Affairs. Thank you for being here bright and early on Monday morning. So just officially for the video, I wanted to note that this is the impacts of the aging population. That's the panel that you're attending this morning. It is panel number 1112, 1112, 9 o'clock on Monday morning, April 4th, 2016. Welcome, everyone. Happy to see you here. So a couple of just logistics things as we get started. Please turn off your cell phones. I hope I turn mine off as well before the live video. So just for the courtesy of the live video as well as the audience. And a couple of other things. We're not taking questions by microphone today. We've moved into the semi-high-tech world. We're going to use little note cards instead today. So audience questions for this panel will be submitted via text and 3x5 cards. This trial format is motivated by a desire to allow our online audience to participate in the Q&A period and by a desire to improve the overall quality of the Q&A period at the CWA. To participate in text question submission, you first need to join the session. In fact, if you think you might ask a question during this session, I'd encourage you to take out your phone now. I'm supposed to pause. Okay. Okay, to join this session, send a text message to the 5-digit phone number 22333. And this is illustrated on the posters on each side of the stage. I hope that's true. I can't quite see them from here. In the body of the message, you'll type the keyword UMCGMB. You'll get a confirmation message that you're now part of the session. And then just reply to that message with your question for the panel. If you're a student, please note this in your question. If you would like your first name and your location to be read aloud, please include this information in your text as well. If you do not have a cell phone, please get the attention of a producer. And so we've got some producers. Betsy's in the back, Bruce is in the front. I will be wandering around the audience as well once we get started. So hopefully you'll recognize me after you've seen me up here. So you can get your attention, and we've got 3x5 cards and pencils to be able to submit your question if you want to do that here in person. And then, yeah, everybody waved their arms. And then finally, text the word leave when you leave the room to close out your session. And then, all right. I'll probably repeat these questions again if you guys need more help after we do some of the speaking. So let's get started for the people that you really wanted to hear. So we've got 3 panelists this morning. Wendy Lustbader, who is going to start us off, has written several books in the field of aging, so very specific policy focus in her life's work, I think, is probably the best way to describe that. So she'll start us off. We've got Dr. Chirangi, who works at a hospital in northeastern Tanzania as a medical practitioner attending patients for medical and surgical health services. And so he will provide a perspective. So while Wendy will start with kind of the general issue of ageism, we'll also be talking from a more international flavor with the message from Dr. Chirangi, and then followed up by Larry Greenwood, who's an economist who has a good deal of experience in the Asian community, and so we'll add another international flair to the perspective that we'll talk about this morning. So without further ado, I will let you hear from the speakers you came to hear from. Wendy.
Thank you. I can't talk sitting down, so what are you going to do? This little mini talk is dedicated to the students in the room. Would you raise your hands high? In the back row? Yes, wonderful. Glad you made it. I want to start with more. Good. Wonderful. You woke up early. Start with a little story. So my husband's here. There's Barry. Raise your hand. So we were in New Zealand, and we couldn't drive on the wrong side of the road. So we took the Kiwi Experience bus. And on that bus were young people from all over the world, maybe 18 to 23 years old. Every country you could imagine was represented on the bus. And to break up the tedium of looking at all the sheep, the driver asked us to take the microphone and say something about ourselves. But I couldn't do it. I get car sick easily. So when my turn came, I took the microphone, fighting back nausea, looked at all the young people on the bus, and I said, "Don't worry. These are the worst years of your lives." And I sat down. And I wasn't kidding. And at the rest stop, first of all, they were all starving because they ran out of money. Barry and I always had to feed the whole bus, because how can you eat a sandwich and not feed the bus? Yeah. But one after another, one young man came up to me and said, "Oh, God bless you, lady. I was thinking of killing myself." The only thing you ever hear, I think he was from England, is in the dominant culture, is, you know, the best years of your lives are now. And he said, I felt if this was the best, I didn't want the rest. Yeah, he was very depressed. And then a young woman came up and said, "I've been wandering the world looking for myself. I can't find myself. I just feel so lost. You made me feel like there's hope. God bless you." Well, I was so blessed. But an idea came to me that I should write a book. And the book is called Life Gets Better. And it's about life getting better on every level as we get older, except the physical. You know, ageism is so deep that older people often don't even identify in themselves how deeply life has gotten better. But no one I've ever met wants to be 20 again. They say, "I'll take the body, but I wouldn't want the life." Because when you're young, and all of you should take heart, you're looking for yourself. You have to figure out how to live, how to love, what you're going to do with your life, what the meaning of your life is. And what happens is, as we get older, we live those questions. We live the mistakes. We're like a pinball bouncing around. It's not linear. It's not like you figure it out and then you live it, right, everyone? It's that you live it and you figure it out. And the growth is tremendous. So I wanted to start our panel with a challenge to what is really, when I say the dominant culture in societies that have left traditional cultures behind. So I'm excited to hear from our panelists. Because in traditional cultures, there is the notion that elders do know how to live and they have something to teach you. And I just want to mention something about elephants. Do you know that if poachers kill the elder elephants in an extended family of elephants, during the next drought, that family of elephants will die. Why? It's because the older elephants remember how to find the water. From the drought 40 years ago, they remember the path to the water. So if you kill the elders, the young people, the young elephants will die. So I think that we have to challenge the ageism in our society. And now with the baby boomer generation just pouring elders into our population, I think we have an opportunity here, an opportunity to change the face of aging in America. I applaud, whether you like Bernie Sanders or not, the guy is up there and out there, and who do you see at his rallies but younger people getting excited? And they're not looking at him through the lens of age, but through the lens of excitement. I think that's an example of an opportunity we have with the aging of society to start to challenge the stereotypes. So, I'm keeping track of the time here. So, one thing we can do that's sort of radical is to get rid of the term the elderly. Is there anyone in the room who feels they're part of that group? No. There are no elderly out there. No one identifies with it. And one of the demands of language is that there be a referent in reality, but there is nothing there. What if we were to change that? And I don't like senior citizen either, but just try this on if you will. If we said that you grow up and become an elder, and that we enter into our elderhood, which I'm borrowing from a wonderful thinker, Dr. Bill Thomas. So in a few weeks, I'm going to turn 62. And when I turned 60, I decided that I could be proud to say, finally, I am entering my elderhood. I just personally decided it started at 60. But it's very different for someone to stand up in front of you and say, I am excited to be an elder. That's just not what we think. So before I give this over to my other panelists, and I hope you'll think about it, I wanted to tell you some of the ways I think life gets better as we get older, and therefore, if elders take more of a voice in our society and have more of a presence, we can help make life better for everyone. Because imagine if younger people knew that these weren't the best years of their lives, that they could go to elders, and some of them are nodding, that you could go to elders and ask some questions about life, instead of the way technology says, you know, if something's 5 years old, throw it away. Yeah. So I brought in a computer that stopped working to the repair shop, and the young man said, "Why are you bringing this here?" with great scorn. "It's more than 3 years old." You know, I was appalled. Okay. At least he didn't take my $75 and flush it down the toilet. Okay. Okay, so ageism is assumptions based on age. Now let me break through some of these assumptions. First of all, to look at an 80-year-old woman and think you know anything about her based on her age is complete foolishness. But you could show me a 5-year-old. It isn't that 5-year-olds don't have distinctive qualities, but through child development literature, I could assume a lot of things about a little girl cognitively, and I know how to play, make her happy, and make her smile. But an 80-year-old, I better not make any assumptions, because we become more distinctive as we get older. We become more different from one another. So you could see why this category, the elderly, talks about no one. Another thing is, it's so fantastic. You reach a certain point where you stop comparing yourself to others. One older woman in an audience raised her hand and said, "Tell me when that's going to start." But it's highly individual as you get older. But there comes a day, and I promise the younger people in the room, when what the other person is doing is not so important. Because you begin to learn what your strengths are. Above all, you learn who you are. And you start to have a voice and to listen to that voice. It is absolutely exquisite. I was in a yoga class in my 50s with my uncoordinated body that doesn't bend in certain places, and everybody else was sitting on the pillow looking really Buddhist. But I was so uncomfortable, I felt like I was going to die. My ankles just wouldn't sit there behind the cushion, and the teacher had said, if you're uncomfortable, go and get these pillows and props. But everyone else looked good, and I was dying. And then I thought, to heck with this! And I got up, I marched over in the silence of the room, I grabbed a bunch of pillows and props, I went back to my spot, made a throne, and I sat there in great comfort. And then about 8 people got up to get the pillows. But I couldn't have done that in my 20s, 30s, or even my 40s. Too self-conscious, too much wanting, not accepting that this was my body and there was nothing I could do about it. I can't sit on those cushions. Okay. Letting go of pettiness. Relationships get better as we get older. Because, this has actually been well studied, that you know what matters and what doesn't, and fighting over the small stuff just gets too old and wearying. And that relates to the counterintuitive idea that as we get closer to dying, as we begin to lose people in our life, you would think that this makes later life just one big funeral. There's the paradox here, that as we get older and we do begin to lose people, especially going through the deaths of our parents, one of the most profound events in the lifespan, death becomes real for us. And in becoming real for us, check this out, younger people, we become more vivacious. Because if this is our only life, and it's not going to go on forever, knowing it intellectually is one thing, but knowing it viscerally is another. And you do not miss a beautiful day, right? A lot of nods in the room. Having gone through loss, we say to ourselves, well, I'm not going to get caught up in this pettiness. I think that I'm going to try this thing I've always wanted to try. If I love to sing, I'm going to take singing lessons by God. And what happens is life becomes more and more precious, and our quality of attention becomes more vivacious. So I'm going to end my little beginning spiel here with a story in honor of my 92-year-old friend, Carter Catlett Williams, one of the leaders of a movement we call the Culture Change Movement, trying to change the culture of aging in America. And I can talk more about that during our discussion. But at 92, she's moved back to Virginia to be near her daughter, and she's got increasing frailty. And I was just there visiting her 2 weeks ago, and she said, Wendy, I can't move as fast. I have to keep my eye on the ground with my walker. My big outing is to make it to the mailbox. It's about 1/8 of a mile through a beautiful landscape. She said, I have never been as attuned to nature and as alive to every bird song, every flower, the leaf on every tree, even the texture of the ground. And as I walked with her, I became more alive. So there's a lot to look forward to, inwardly and outwardly. Thank you very much.
My name is Tom Chesney, and I'm your moderator for this panel. We're next going to hear from Dr. Chirangi. Doctor?
Would you like to use this one? Okay. Oh, wait, it's got to come on. Sorry. There it is. It's on now.
Thank you for having this morning. As I was introducing the first, I'm Chirangi. I'm the medical director of one of the district hospital at the rural area at Tanzania. We are located just close to the Lake Victoria. I'm very proud to be here joining with you for this conference, and I would like to share with you my experience in working to that rural area hospital and taking care for the elderly people, especially for the older people in this community. One of my special concern is I'm also popular for taking care for the older people, especially in that hospital, since majority of the doctors, sometimes they hide to take care for the older people because of the time consuming. Having patients to the outpatient, sometimes it takes time to take the history for the older people because they came with multiple complaints always. So they will come and they will always complaining more than what makes them to come in the hospital. But I'm proud with my professional because I feel that those people made us, mean that those are people already worked for a long time, spending their time and making a lot of things to my community. So starting one of the impact which has been mostly happening to my community is always the demand of intensive care because of the multiple complaints, as I said, and they need a lot of investigations which they needed to be done. And the place where I work, there's a shortage of resources, especially for the not only human resource, but also for the equipments and the drugs and other supplies. So we have a lot of older people who have been coming in the hospital. Sometimes they don't get enough care because of those shortage of facilities. And in my country currently, because with the new government, they're trying the best now to improve, but still majority of the people they don't have insured. I mean that health insurance. So it's one of the big challenge which is facing for the older people who maybe they have retired or those who was not even works to the work to the government or work to the big companies. So still they need a lot of service, especially health insurance, and maybe to take care for them. On looking for the perspective of the social on that area, we as Tanzanian, especially in Africa, we respect all the people always. We respect them, and whenever it happens, there's any position, whenever there's need any wisdom, any decision, we ask them seek for idea from them. So it's still applicable for my community to ask the older people, to ask them if they can support or they can advise for the sake of improvement or anything. Whenever there's anything which is controversial or something which is discussing to the community, still we give them the chances for helping us. But not only that, even the political side. Majority of the youth or young people still sometimes they still need idea, they need the wisdom from the older people who can advise them the way of political will or political party, how they could learn or how they could go according to the setup of that particular area. So as I said, I work in the rural area. It's far from the center of center of Tanzania, in the rural area. So we have a majority of small groups of the older people who we keep them like advisor for our hospital and our community, and they're being joined several times for issues which happen in the health related to our community too. So as I said again, that there's a couple of challenges facing. It's not only for the demanding for them for the sick for health, but also they need care. We don't have home care like you do here. Most of the elderly people, all the people stay with their families. So we needed to, we've been introducing like program called the home care. Like we tried to visit them and supporting them at home. And the majority of the older people, they are suffering from different diseases because they are at risk, you know, as the life expectancy is not like your country. So they are susceptible to most of the diseases. They are susceptible. And this means that the immunity is low. So that's why we have started this home care, taking care for visiting them at home. So they need health education. Some of them, they need help in health education. They need help at home. But we don't have good system because of the, not only infrastructure, but also because of the expenses who could take care for them. Currently, we are just also strengthen the home care by introducing the social welfares, let's say like social workers to support the program. And currently, as I said, with the new government now in Tanzania, our president is trying the best to make sure that we can improve to support these elderly people, especially for seeking for the health care. And my hospital, as I said, is a district hospital in Tanzania, just close to the Lake Victoria. We just started a kind of special clinic for older people, so that we are trying to reduce or to take away the bureaucracy or sometimes to delay for them to get the care for the hospital. So we are more focusing to make sure that the elderly people who are coming, they are sick, and the children, they can get care as soon as possible according. So we have some doctors whom we are trying to allocate them to make sure that they are taking care for them. So this is one of the, I wanted to share with you the good plan we are trying to help the aging population. Those people who are old and they have a lot of challenges and impact on health-related issue to my community. So I think I will speak more whenever there was more questions. Because of the time, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chirangi. Now we're going to hear from Larry Greenwood. Larry?
Thank you, Tom. You know, I was introduced as an economist, and that's true. And so, please don't judge me. Economists have gotten a bad rap. I think partly for good reasons after 2008. I'm going to talk about mainly Japan, and I spent a lot of my career in Japan, and most recently just came back to the States after living in Japan for 4 years, and I've been there a total of 15 over the last 40. And I want to talk about it because Japan is going to be a laboratory in the world for studying how a country deals with an aging population. Japan has the oldest population of any major country in the world today. It has one of the fastest aging countries. And let me just maybe start with a story. About 15 years ago, there were twin women in Japan. They were 103 years old. And they became TV celebrities because they were very funny and witty. And 103-year-old twins are fairly rare, even in Japan, where you have a lot of 100-year-old people. And one was asked, and they made a lot of money from their TV appearances. And so one was asked, so what are you going to do with all your money? And she looked at the interviewer like he was crazy. Well, she said, of course, I'm going to save up for my old age. So just look at some of the numbers. Today, about 26% of the population is 65 years of age or older. And just to put that in perspective, in Boulder, that number is 9%. And in the United States, it's 13%. In Japan, 26%. And it's growing. That older. I have to be careful now. Wendy says I'm not supposed to say elderly. The older cohort, older people. That older cohort of over 65 is, of course, increasing quite rapidly. And the reason for that is that you have people live a long time in Japan, and it's one of the most longest lived people on Earth. Has to do with a combination of diet and public transportation, frankly, the exercise. The other reason is that they have one of the lowest birth rates in the world. And so the combination of that means that the number of, the percentage of people over 65 is increasing quite rapidly. And the working population to support that population of older people, of course, is shrinking. Overall, the population of Japan is shrinking. So it'll be the first industrial country, actually probably the first country of any level of development that actually will see a secular decline of their population going into the future. The only other country actually that went through that was Ireland, but that was because of the potato famine in the 19th century. And they haven't actually recovered their population since that time. But that's a very different situation. Japan will be the first country that goes through this. But in fact, lots of other countries are going to be following very soon. Korea is on the same path as Japan. Italy is on the same path. A number of Western European countries are there. And eventually the United States will be on that same path as well. I should also say that China is on that same path in a very dangerous kind of way because of various other policies. But it's mainly because you have, it's mainly a good news story that people are living longer and people are having smaller families because when you're richer, you have smaller families. So it's a combination of good health and prosperity. But it does present lots of challenges, both economically as well as socially. The main economic challenge is because labor force is shrinking, how do you keep growing your economy to basically support the social services and the increased social services that you have to support with a growing older population? The social challenge is how do you take care of the older people, right? And so the whole caretaker, and we just heard from Dr. Chirangi that it's mainly home care in Africa, which is great. And in fact, Japan has moved from that home care to a lot more focus on older retired living types of situations, old folks' homes, but is now actually trying to go back to more home care because frankly they just can't financially support that. Plus, we could talk about this later. There's social issues. I mean, I think most older people would like to stay in their homes and stay with their families. And so that's a whole big social issue for Japan today. Let me talk a little bit about how the government is dealing with this issue, and the government is very much seized with that today in Japan. On the economic front, one of the major changes that are taking place as a result of this actually is a whole other issue that we'll talk a lot about in other sessions this week, and that is bringing more women into the workplace and having more roles for women in the workplace at more senior levels. And that's a huge problem for Japan. They have, particularly at senior management levels, very, very small number of women. Women can't, it's very difficult for them to participate in the workforce in a regular way. So most women in the workforce today are temps. And that means that they don't have careers. That means they don't get paid as well. And then the other problem with women is that they're the ones who have to bear the burden of taking care of the elderly, of their parents and their in-laws. And for social reasons, that's fallen on women's shoulders more, and frankly, I think it's the same in the States as well. And but not only are they expected to work more now, they're also expected to take care of their parents. So clearly, that's not sustainable. So they're looking at a number of policies. One is, and I'm sorry, the other thing about women is to make sure that they can work and have families, because one of the reasons for the low birth rate is that women who do work, you don't have many choices in Japan in terms of daycare and things of that sort. So it's difficult to be a working mother in Japan. So they're trying to make some changes, increasing daycare support. The government's putting a lot more money into daycare. They're looking at maternity. They're increasing maternity leave. They're increasing paternity leave, which is important because they have to get men to do more in Japan. So a number of issues around that. We can talk more if people are interested. They're looking at increasing the retirement age. In fact, they have increased the retirement age. They're going to be doing that more because, again, for financial reasons, they can't sustain financially health care without keeping people in the working population longer. And that raises a whole set of questions about how do you provide fulfilling employment opportunities for older folks. And that's also a big issue here and one that U.S. is already looking at. They're looking at deregulating the economy in order to improve on the supply side, improve productivity. So if you are going to have fewer laborers, you need to have higher productivity if you're going to maintain a good economic growth rate. You don't need to have a huge economic growth rate because your population is shrinking. So what you have to do is maintain your per capita income. But you still have to have increased productivity to do that. So they're making a number of changes in changing the way that the economy is structured so that you can get higher productivity. Taxes, that's a big issue for the United States as well in terms of so the tax system is going to have to change if you're going to deal with a larger older population. And basically you have to move from dependence on income tax to a dependence on consumption tax. And that's what Japan is doing now. The United States is still very, probably the farthest behind in the world in that area, and since we don't have a national consumption tax, and we rely very much on income tax. So that's something that's going to have to give at some point in the United States. And then this is very macroeconomic, and so I apologize for it, but it is important to say that Japan has been in deflation now for a number of decades, and that actually is a huge problem for the future of the country and for the aging of the country, because the only way they can really deal with the debt is to have some level of inflation that then essentially kind of the debt burden erodes over the years if you have inflation. And they've been struggling with getting the deflation turned around and to have small 2% inflation to help with that overall debt issue. On the micro side, there's the major challenges are how to take care of the elderly. And as I mentioned before, they're looking at a number of ways of doing that. They are still supporting retirement homes and looking at ways to increase that. And that's still a growing industry. But as I mentioned before, they do have a policy now to try to support, as we just heard from Dr. Chirangi, they're trying to support in Japan as well more in-home care. So there's getting doctors to actually leave their clinics and go out and visit the patients in their home, to a whole set of medical equipment and things that the people can use in the home so that they don't have to go to the clinics. What I also just heard was interesting, and that is the amount of time that the older population goes to a clinic or a hospital is actually quite high in Japan, because in many cases that people go for social reasons. There's lots of the older people don't have a lot of things going on in their homes. And so, they end up in the clinic just basically to visit people and to visit their doctor and just to have someone to talk to. It's a little bit sad, and actually that's a big social problem in Japan. Is that a lot of, particularly since the number of children are much smaller, if their children aren't caring for them, many people, older people, do live by themselves. And in fact, there's a Japanese word or expression for people who die alone in their apartments, and actually it occurs sadly all too often in Japan. People will simply pass away in their apartments, and actually could be months before they're even found, and that's actually very sad. So that whole question about how do you bring out the older population, give them something to engage in, particularly for the men. The women generally tend to do better, but the retired men really have a huge issue, since so much of our life is based around work, that when they do retire and become old, they have difficulty adjusting to that. The other big problem for this issue in Japan is the rural areas. So outside of Tokyo, there's a preponderance of the elderly live outside of Tokyo and live in the rural areas, because mainly the young people have come to the major cities and leaving the countryside pretty much depopulated except for older. That's why during the tragic tsunami of March 2011, that's why such a high percentage of those people, about 60% of the loss, the people we lost there, were over 65. And it wasn't because they were necessarily slower, it's just that's because the preponderance of people living in those areas happen to be older. And so that question about how you deal with these large groups of elderly people living in rural areas who don't have young people there to take care of them is a problem, or to interact with as well. So let me just stop there. I think for the U.S., some of the lessons are going to be on the macro side. Clearly, how we increase productivity to keep growing. It's very hard to make these adjustments if you have a shrinking economy, or your economy is not growing. The tax reform is a very important one for us. How you deal with financing retirement, and people talk a lot about that these days. That's a huge issue. In Japan, it's largely taken on by the government, but that's no longer viable. It's not sustainable financially, so they're going to have to find ways of sharing that burden. Here in the United States, we have kind of the other way. It's very much an individual responsibility, with the government taking a little less, although we have a social security system, but which is frankly not financially sustainable either. So we have issues that we're going to have to deal with there. And again, I think as we go in the next decade or so, we should be looking very closely at Japan to see how they resolve these problems, because those will help be useful lessons for us. Thanks.
Larry, thank you very much for your comments. Question directed to Dr. Chirangi. As we age, our bodies change physically. Can you comment briefly for us on what some of those changes are, and do they have certain milestones that accompany them that we need to be wary of, or are there ways to reverse the aging process?
I want to know the last sentence. The last question I want to know. How to reverse the aging process.
Well, yeah, as I said, of course, it's kind of difficult, I could say, because I'm more involved on, as I said, treating the elderly patients, especially in the old population. And as I said in the beginning, that they came with multiple complaints. And also, addition, it's cost more than, it's more costly to take care for them. Most of the health providers, especially doctors, they take time to decide how they could take care for these older people. And very interesting, sometimes patient might come with a particular disease or particular complaint which makes him to come to the hospital. So the soonest you are almost done, she or he might say, I'm sorry, I just remember something. I have also some problem is happening. Then you start again to explain another problem, maybe from another system. So it's a very difficult to say like reverse. That means that it's more needed time, and what is supposed to be is to look at those multiple complaints and to look which is more serious and which is needed to be taken. So that's I could say on that.
Thank you very much. I want to remind everyone that you are able to text your questions to UMCGMB to 22333, And we've got several questions now that I'd like to turn to. The first one is for Larry. How would you compare the Japanese issues and experience or other Asian countries to how the older population is being dealt with?
Yeah, I think one of the major changes, or what major differences between Japan and other countries, and this is in some way a good thing for the United States, but it also makes the Japanese situation a bit purer, in the sense you can see more clearly some of the choices, and that is the fact that they are not open for immigration in any major way, and so a lot of the and that has two impacts in Japan. One is, of course, that without immigration, you do age faster. So a lot of the reasons that the United States is such a young country still is because of immigration, both the immigration and the fact that first-generation immigrants from particularly traditional societies tend to have larger families. And I know that that's a very controversial issue in the campaign, but putting some of those things aside, the good thing about that, and I think it's a really important good thing, is that it does make your economy more dynamic. You have younger people. That's frankly good for the economy. There's no question in my mind that immigration is good for the economy. They may have some other issues that you have to deal with. But Japan is, for social reasons, this is simply not open to that. They're trying to open up a little bit, but frankly, my view is that Japan will never be open to the kind of immigration that we have in the United States, or even in other countries that are not as open to immigration as we are. And so therefore, they need to find other ways of dealing with it. And again, we can learn some things from that. And the major way they're looking at that, besides, as I mentioned before, some of the other things about bringing more women into the workforce and having other ways of dealing with it, for caring of the individuals, they're looking at robots. And so the whole question of medical technology and particularly robot aided, using robots for helping the elderly is huge. And they're looking at things like machines that wash people, right? And so you can actually, you don't have to have someone, because also Japanese are also very sensitive about being a burden on people. And so not to get too explicit here, but it's embarrassing for them to ask for help to wash their bodies. And so to be able to do that with a machine is really interesting for Japanese. They have one company is developing a pair of pants that actually, when you step into them, you can, it's like an exoskeleton, right? You can walk much more easily if you have weak legs. So just really interesting things on the tech side that they're looking at. It reminds me of a New York Times article that just came out 2 days ago. I don't know if you all saw it, about it's the opposite, where they have this for this suit. You probably saw this, Wendy. They had this suit that you can put on, and there's a headset as well to simulate being old. So it basically makes it difficult to move, and it's hard to breathe, and you can't see very well. and it's supposed to help with the empathy thing.
It makes your life worse.
Yeah. So this is the opposite. They're actually looking for things to essentially make your life, to deal with what Wendy was talking about. Everything else gets better, except things do break down. It's the reason I didn't stand up to give my talk, is because I have a bad leg that's hard to stand up. So so they're working on those kinds of things. So I think that's one of the interesting areas where again, the other thing that distinguishes them from a lot of other countries, particularly China and Tanzania and other countries, is that Japan is a very wealthy country, and so they do have that huge advantage that, frankly, China does not have, and that's why China's challenges would be much more difficult.
Thank you, Larry. We've got a number of questions from the audience, and I want to open one up now. And the question was, how do we impart the wisdom that the parents have to their children? And I'd open that up to one of the panelists to address it. Anyone want to take it on?
I'll take that, yeah. Our parents are the people on earth we see the least clearly, right? And you can meet a stranger on the bus and in a 15-minute conversation see and perceive that person with a lot more depth than you can your own mother or father. And it's also, the words of a parent have a different kind of weight and meaning. So our kids, until they get old enough to realize that it's okay to listen to what an elder might have to impart, particularly a parent, there's a long period where kids are unable to learn primarily from their parents, and they need to go out into the world and make some of their own mistakes and have their own victories and find their own voice. So it's an eternal problem that goes from generation to generation. But again, one of the exciting things is as you get older and maybe reach your 30s and 40s, if you're lucky enough to have your parents still alive, that can be a time when you can really sit down and suddenly begin to see them as human beings and move into another kind of back and forth reciprocal learning. So very good question. And anyone else want to respond?
You were talking about how you tap into the wisdom of the older people.
Yeah, I was very touched by what you said about elders being asked questions about when they had a big decision to make.
What's an example of that?
Do you want to?
Yeah, thank you. So as I said, that being old in our community is people see you have a kind of wisdom, and you can help with this community whenever there's any things happening which maybe need some advice from the higher authority or something like that, in a political way, in a social way. So we believe that somebody who has been old, aged, and also together with experiencing on his or her professional, she knows a lot than other people. That's the issue. So whenever there's anything happening, always we use them as their consensus for anything. So even when you go to the, there's in a court or something, there's a special committee for all the people, or you find that they are like consensus for anything which happen in that community. So that's how we do.
Another question that we have is, how can we keep our healthcare costs from bankrupting the young? Would one of you like to take that?
Give it to the economist.
Well, that's a great question, and it's obviously the one that all countries around the world are having to deal with now, because I don't think there's any country in the world that is actually financially prepared to deal with this with the issue. Certainly not the United States. I don't have the answers, let me say, but clearly the part of the answer that Japan's looking at, and we're doing it here as well, is that people will need and should want to work longer. So extending retirement ages clearly is going to be part of that solution. That'll be painful, obviously. I mean, there's going to be the burdens are going to have to be shared here, because currently the way we're heading in the United States, we are putting all the burden on our children and their children, and that's not right, frankly. So we're the older cohort is going to have to make some sacrifices, and this plays out, as everyone knows, in the politics as well. I mean, at the same time, the older cohort goes to the polls more than the younger people do, so they're voting more. They have more political influence than the young in Washington, D.C. So it's there's some real political issues that are facing us in this area. The other part of the solution, of course, is we've got to find some ways of getting the actual cost of healthcare down, and that's not an area where we're making much progress today. And part of it is the drugs, part of it's the medical equipment, and part of it's the cost of the hospital service itself. And in almost every one of those areas, the United States has not been able to find the way to deal with that. Japan is actually slightly more successful than we are in that area. It's a single payer system, meaning that it's a national coverage, 100%, and you pay into it as an employee, or if you're self-employed, you pay into it, and you get it's paid for by the government. And as a result, the government can control the costs a little bit, significantly more than the United States. So that there is advantages in single payer. I'm not advocating single payer for the United States because I think it's just too big an adjustment, but certainly we have to find ways to deal with those healthcare costs. So that's just a couple of them. Another one might be to think about is how we can encourage folks of any age just to have a healthier lifestyle. Because a lot of our costs are because of the essentially chronic diseases that are essentially lifestyle diseases, heart disease, cardiovascular diseases, and we haven't. I mean, the baby boomers have not done a great job of taking care of ourselves. We're doing a better job now because it was more education and consciousness raising, but we've got to do a better job of stopping the deterioration, and we have a lot of control over that.
Thank you. Related question. This one is for Wendy. And how do you view our current approach to healthcare, which seems to focus on keeping people alive without an equal attention on choices about the quality of life? And related to that is, or a follow-on question is, what is the impact of dementia on the population and aging?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'll start with the first one. So, life has to have a purpose and has to have meaning. And so there is that spiritual dimension to life. And there is an over-focus in our society on the physical body. And, someone needs to sit down with you when you're facing a major decision when you're, let's say, 85, instead of just telling you, well, here's the surgery and this is what we want to do for you. We really need someone to sit down and talk about quality of life and say, well, you're going to have certain limitations after the surgery that may confine your life in ways that you don't really want this. So it's really interesting if you lay things out for people, not just as a choice between, well, you better have this or not, but rather a middle ground where here's all the things you'll be facing. So that's in the medical side. But I think we can change things. We can get it in our national dialogue about what is the older years for. What are we doing there? And there's a rise now that's very exciting in post-retirement contributions to one's community, kind of going back to what traditional cultures always had and continue to have, which is to be valued is to have a contribution that something that you can actually give that younger people are going to seek out. So quality of life, I would argue, has everything to do with being able to contribute. And it's to equate contribution with economic contribution, I think, is a big mistake that we make in the United States. So many people feel when they retire, they're no longer valuable in the way they always felt valuable, which is based on what you're earning. So wouldn't it be great if the coming generation, this preponderance of baby boomers that's here now, begins to change the idea of retirement into meaningful contribution and real quality of life, which has to do with young and old flowing together like a river. And there I'm quoting Hazel Wolf, the great environmentalist who died at 101, while she was typing on a typewriter the latest edition of her environmental newsletter. So I think this is whoever asked that question, this is really where the action is. We need to have a lot of lively dialogue. So take it from the healthcare arena and spread it out into the area of spirituality and purpose.
Thank you. A follow-on question is, what about legalizing euthanasia as a solution to not breaking the backs of our youth? And how is this viewed from one country to another? How about Japan, Larry?
Well, I can address it, I guess. I mean, in Japan, there is, I'm not sure if there certainly is the conventional wisdom is that there was a tradition in Japan, this is pre-war, pre-World War II, that if an elderly person was just no longer could contribute to society at all, they would take them to the mountains and leave them there to die. And there's a term in Japanese for that. my own view is, looking at some of the historians on this, is that may be kind of semi-mythological. But it does kind of represent a feeling in Japan that, including among older folks, that if they can't contribute, then they are being a burden, and no one likes to be a burden. Having said that, I mean, clearly euthanasia is definitely not being promoted, or not being, people aren't saying that's something they should do in Japan, and certainly shouldn't be done here. So I think it's, I mean, the direction obviously is not that. It needs to be what Wendy just said. We need to increasingly find ways of allowing the elderly to have fulfilling lives. And I mean, and I agree about the economic. It shouldn't be limited to an economic value. But frankly, older folks can add economic value.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm mid-60s now. I certainly intend to work for at least another 10 years, and then do more of a nonprofit kind of stuff. But I mean, everyone has their own timetable, right? But to find the ability to do that is important. And let me just end it by saying, I think part of the problem is that, at least for me, I found it very difficult to find something that kind of fit in with what I want to do. I don't want to work 70 to 80 hours a week like I was when I was in my 40s, but I want to do something fulfilling. And how do you find something with between 30 and 40 hours a week that's fulfilling? And creating those kinds of opportunities, whether they're economic, nonprofit, or completely voluntary type of work, or contribution, I think is important. But I found it difficult personally just to find that right fit at mid-60s. Yeah.
Thank you. An additional question is, for one of our panelists, would you comment on the fleecing of the elderly by people tricking them on the phone or via the internet and social media? Is this common in other countries?
Well, I'll be real short on this one. Yeah, the answer is yes. It's a huge issue. It's a huge issue in America. Financial abuse of the elderly is a major problem, and in Japan it's also a big problem. And I used to work for an insurance company, so this was very much of an issue for our company, MetLife, in Japan. It's up to, I think, a combination of government and companies to really just crack down and find ways to stop that. Consciousness raising, obviously, among the elderly is important, but this goes to your question about dementia that wasn't addressed, and that's the problem with there are some cognitive declines that go with the physical declines as you get older. That makes people obviously more vulnerable, and so there needs to be mechanisms in place. In our company, we had a very set regimen for dealing with people over 75, I think it was, that you had to go through if you sold them an insurance product, because we needed to make very clear, to the prospective customer that we were meeting their needs and selling a particular product to them. But not all companies were as good as that, so that's a big problem.
Well, it's such a big problem. I mean, I don't have too much cognitive decline yet, but last week I got something that said it was from USAA, my insurance company, and it said click on here because someone's using your account and verify these expenses. And my finger hovered over and then I went, oop, this is kind of weird. And I held back, called USAA, and they said, we did not send that. So I think this sort of phishing thing, it's getting more and more sophisticated. And USAA said they have to get rid of 2,400 false websites a year that are, and so it's hitting people of all ages. I think that the internet has opened up a great place for, these crooks. But exploitation of elders is a huge problem in the United States, as you said. And I wonder if it's much of a problem in Tanzania, elders being exploited. Here we have family members exploiting some of their parents. This is a subject that's very difficult for elders to report or talk about, but if you have an older son or daughter who's on the detour of alcohol and drugs, they can sometimes move into the parent's house and start drinking and drugging the whole Social Security check. And this is a major problem in the United States. How's it going there in Tanzania with exploitation.
Yeah, as I said, even for to establish the home care, it's not only for the issue of resources, but also families like to stay with their parents at home, and still it's kind of having a parent, even if she or he's very old, still you need a lot of seek for him whenever there's anything you need to get an advice or from as a family, because that's the one, the head of the family.
Yes.
So there's a big respect to the older people in the family among of them. So if it happen like that one, usually it's a kind of completely regard to the family, and sometimes even the extended family will be called coming and sitting together, and now they'll be trying to see what was happening and why he or she decided to do that for the parents. So that's it.
Dr. Chirangi, here is a follow-up question. Regarding elders raising their grandchildren due to the AIDS epidemic that is so large in South Africa, is it the same in Tanzania? Taking care of AIDS patients within the family, is that a problem in Tanzania?
Well, the challenges comes from the cost, because as I said, is mostly it's more cost to take care for them. That's the main challenge, and majority of the elder, as I said, they don't have health maybe insurance, and sometimes because of the extended family also involving together. So that's the big challenge happening. But still, with the all limitation of the resources, maybe with their poverty, still the family are trying the best to make sure that they take care for the elder at the family.
What about HIV/AIDS? Is that and how that figures into the healthcare? Is that
Yeah, the HIV.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah.
is that it?
He was just clarifying.
Yes, the HIV is a big problem. It's a big problem. Where I work is the prevalence of HIV is more than 10% for the prevalence of HIV. So you might see there's a lot of patients who are suffering from HIV in that community. So it's a distract, and it's mostly one of the big challenges in that community because of the burden of the diseases and the opportunistic diseases which is affecting to the community. So there's a lot of cost, especially invest more on the health issues related because of the complications.
I wonder if some of the elders are taking care of younger HIV
Yes,
family
absolutely.
members.
They take care. They take, because the most vulnerable age is the youngest. Those are the big, so they're taking care for them.
Another question is, have you noticed a difference in brain aging cross-culturally versus Japan and Africa? Dr. Chirangi, we'll address it to you first.
Cross-cultural, well, maybe, of course, there's a lot of things happening, especially in our community, especially for the social issues related in the cross-cultural issues. I mean, when I compare, I've not been in Japan, of course, but mostly of the I could say the custom and the taboos which happen in Tanzania is more on basis on tradition in my community, and it's a little bit difficult for sometimes making the changes because it's the way of life of people staying in this community. And most of the community, especially for the elder, as I said, they are being seen or like consistency in the community. So whenever there's anything which I wanted to be changed or something which people are trying to come across, still mostly people follow the tradition which has been existing in that community.
You know, I lived in Africa, but it was many years ago, 30, 40 years ago, and so my sense is that the main difference, frankly, is that, and actually Dr. Chirangi mentioned it briefly, is that since the life expectancy is pretty different between Africa and Japan, where you have Japan being one of the most longest lived in Africa, still, I mean, it's going up quite dramatically, but still has a ways to go, is that obviously you have cognitive decline problems increase more when you have an older population. And so, in a sense, it's that it's the good news part of the story. We have dementia wasn't so much of an issue, of course. When you die at 50, dementia wouldn't be an issue. And so, in Japan, I think I don't think it's going to be that different from the United States. Frankly, it's mainly a lot about in terms of cognitive decline. It's a lot about lifestyle and finding a fulfilling activity or activities to be involved in. And as a result, I think you have much more of a problem in Japan with men who retire, as I mentioned before, than you do with women, because women have already their social networks set up to, through their lives. And but men, when they leave the company, their social network is gone. And, they may maybe go out drinking with their old buddies once a month, but that's it. They go back to a house where they've spent no time because they go to work at 9 o'clock in the morning, come back at midnight for 35, 40 years to retire, and so there's nothing for them. So I think that's the main reason for cognitive decline, is not having anything to be fulfilled about.
Yeah, thanks. I'd like to follow up on both of those. I think the key word universally is engagement, and it's engagement in one's community. The use it or lose it idea is really true. So if you're stimulated because people need you, maybe you are caring for grandchildren and helping out, or taking care of someone in the family who has HIV perhaps, and you're needed, there are some demands on you that are real. It's what we might call a vital involvement. And if I could critique the United States for a minute, we have so much picking up and moving going on, and I know I'll touch a nerve to some people in perhaps this community that moved here to this wonderful place from long-standing communities elsewhere. It's difficult to reestablish yourself, and I always say to groups, if you're going to move to a new community in later life, weigh that decision very carefully. What kind of networks of reciprocity are you leaving behind? And make sure when you move to a new community, you establish the means of engagement, of being involved in the community. And I'm really struck by, you talk a lot about the word community and engagement and elders being part of what's going on. I just think that's a huge issue for the brain and for that kind of vitality cognitively. Thank you.
A slightly different question is, will the panelists expand on the economic impacts of reduced immigration, the availability of nurses, and the availability of domestic workers?
I'll just touch on it briefly because I mentioned it already, but clearly it would be a big issue, and if the United States actually turned, if we started to significantly reduce immigration, already we have, of course, reduced immigration over the last 5 or 6 years, well, 10 years, I think. But if we actually take an anti-immigration stance, and some of the candidates are talking about that, it would be clearly a huge problem economically for this country. And so we obviously need the nurses, we need the caregivers, we need the IT specialists, we need all kinds of different skills. The more open we are to that, the better our economy is going to be. And Japan, it just shows you what, that's an extra challenge they have. I don't advocate that they should try to change fundamentally the culture that would allow immigration. I don't think, frankly, that Japan could sustain that culturally. So I don't advocate that, but it does make the challenge of dealing with this demographic changes much more difficult.
I'll just add a really wonderful essay you can find by Googling around if you're good at that. So this humanities scholar is named Kathleen Woodward, and she's at University of Washington. So if you go into the UW website, you'll find her name. She has an essay which she has posted there called The Public Secret. And it's about the fact that elder care, at least in America, depends almost entirely on the backs of immigrant women many of whom are disenfranchised or in the underground economy, that the whole system would really fall apart if we didn't have these women. But it's a public secret in that we don't really talk about it or analyze it or even count it in the way that this phenomenon is just so vital. So I think that was a very good point, the person that wrote that question. And this essay that the public secret really lays it out. It's just gorgeous. Another good person to follow up on is Jen Poo. She's going around the country now speaking about this fact, this elder care workforce of immigrant women.
Thank you. Another question is, women statistically outlive men. What impact does that have on older populations?
He asked, do women outlive men in Tanzania? And he said,
Yes.
of course.
Yeah, of course, the proportion is higher than men. That is, yeah. Maybe also adding for the issue of the impact of the elderly women to my community. We do have this we call traditional birth attendants. Maybe you heard about that. Those traditional birth attendants, they are non-skilled, like when at school for health, but they grew and came to experiencing of assisting delivery to the community. And hence that most of the community, there's a shortage of health providers, especially the healthcare system, especially in Tanzania. So in traditional, these elder women, they've been doing this assisting delivery for the at homes. Yeah, when we say home delivery, it's completely different in America. That's you'll be assisted by the professional. But when you say home delivery to, especially in my rural area, Tanzania, it will be assisted by non-skilled personnel, but the traditional expensing on doing on that kind of assisting delivery. So currently, we are working as to establish a new system like integrated healthcare. So to see if there can be a good link, like those traditional birth attendants, they can influence the women to deliver to the hospital where there is maybe good service, of course, good service, and also to identify mothers at risk. So mostly they've been doing this, and they are older age, mean that they are elder and old to this community. And that's they have been doing.
So the older women are the bed attendants?
Yes,
and there's
exactly.
Sort of it's sort of a proud tradition. It's a set of skills.
Exactly.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Very interesting. You know, the gap between men and women in terms of longevity is closing very rapidly. And some people think that as women have entered the workforce more and more in this country and things are more equalizing in that sphere, that women are becoming more like men in not a good way in terms of putting aside time with friends, focusing on achievement at work, being busy, faces in the computer, whereas women in the past spent more time focusing on relationships. And some people think that the higher stress without taking that community time, if you will, that's part of why the age gap is closing, which is kind of a frightening idea.
Thank you. You've got a two-part question now, and for Wendy, the question is, should we do away with the idea of retirement? And following up on that, the question is, should our law require financial advisors to have the responsibility as fiduciaries?
Okay, I'll do the first one, you do the second one. Yeah. Well, you know, first of all, I want to speak up for social justice here. Remember that, everybody? Social justice, yeah. So retirement is a privilege of having money. I mean, if we're talking about retiring from a job. So many older women, especially from communities of color in the United States, have to go on working as long as they can, and despite maybe having an aching back and many troubles. So I always like to at least give a nod to the fact that retirement literally isn't for everyone, because we do have Social Security, yes, but the cost of housing relative to income is one of the most important social changes in America. And if your Social Security check barely pays for where you are living and eating, you might have to go down to the local McDonald's and hope that they value older workers, which, by the way, they tend to do in some communities. So you can actually even work a minimum wage job so you can buy your groceries. So this is where economics is really important. But for people with the privilege to be able to live without working, and somehow you've saved or even have an old-fashioned pension, or you're lucky and you've made it into the dwindling supplies of senior housing that's subsidized. So let's say you can retire. I actually don't believe myself in traditional retirement if that means really withdrawing from the world of contribution, as I said earlier. I think that what I've witnessed in my work as a social worker is people who pull back entirely, 100%, into what we might call leisure, actually experience a kind of deadening process that occurs, and it's even cognitive, as I intimated earlier. It seems to me we need at least one day a week, different from the rest, that is not about ourselves, but is about others. And somehow this sustains us mentally, emotionally, that we feel better about life. And this is being borne out in the research. But let's hear some more.
Well, it's out the fiduciary thing. Just to explain the question itself. So, in the United States, if you have a financial advisor, the question is, does that financial advisor work for you, or does he or she work for the companies that are providing the financial products that you're going to be buying, or the investments that you're going to be making? And so it's a big question. It's been debated now for many decades, and there isn't any kind of ready answer. Obviously, the industry doesn't want to have that fiduciary responsibility. They want to keep it vague. Customers, really, frankly, should know. I mean, my personal view is that the customers should at least know if that person that's advising you is representing a company or representing you. And so if they're getting a commission for the products that they're recommending you buy, that's something you should at least know as a customer. And so that's, at the very least, we should have that. We don't actually have that legally required yet in the United States. Many other markets, that is actually required. So it's reform. It's being discussed now, and I will slowly make our way to more transparency in that in this sector.
Thank you. We're at the conclusion of our program right now. I wanted to comment to the question, how can parents impart wisdom to younger people? And I'm reminded that most of the bookstores carry a grandparent's book that has a series of questions that you can answer that can be very helpful in telling your story and being able to pass it on to your heirs or others. I want to remind everyone that our panelists come here at their own expense, make their own arrangements, and we're very pleased to have them. That's throughout the conference, and I especially want to thank our participants today, and thanks to all of you for coming. Our session is now ended.